I'm Abhishek, and you're listening to Connected by mParticle, where we interview the people that help create some of the most beloved brands in the world. These folks have a unique ability to bring together seemingly unrelated people and technologies to deliver some truly amazing results. On this episode of Connected, we sit down with Sean Oakley for an enlightening conversation about the history of online advertising. We also discuss some of the major shifts taking place in the industry. Hint, hint, it's got something to do with cookies, and how organizations can adapt to continue to drive high performance ad programs while respecting consumer privacy. Sean, thank you so much for making the time to jump on the pod today. I know this is an episode that's not only timely, but you're someone that I've wanted to get on for a while. So really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
I mean, I guess maybe a good place to start would be to turn it over to you, to give a little introduction about yourself and sort of what you do.
Sure. So I'm Sean Oakley, I think as you already said, and I lead the ad tech practice at Peacock, NBC Peacock, the streaming service for Peacock. I have a kind of an interesting career trajectory where I came out of media buying, and so I spent years in client and agency side buying media, and then I think over the years I slowly transitioned into more of the ad tech side. And when people ask me why, I think it was always kind of the same use case. I was always trying to build consumer journeys or build these interesting touch points, and it always drove me back into the tech to be able to have to do all of that. And so over the years, I just picked up a lot of the tech as I went. And then as the industry evolved and in general, I ended up migrating fully into the ad tech side, and I don't buy media anymore. And then also coincidentally, a few years back, I guess a little bit more than a few at this point, I started working at HBO, running their ad tech and their audience targeting, and that was my first foray into the streaming world. And so since then, I've got a good 5 years of experience in streaming too, which is a whole other interesting set of complexities when it comes to ad tech and using data in general. But I guess that would be my quick elevator pitch of an intro.
Sure. Well, listen, I know, I set you up for that because I think there's a lot of media topics in that sort of intro. So, Sean, the reason I was so fascinated to have you on is because, in your time, I think you've seen, and particularly when we talk about like ad tech, media buying, and really this just extends to like how a brand like an HBO or Peacock can really connect and reach out and engage with their customers. I mean, a big technical component of this is the cookie, right? And I know one of the things you were on record saying a couple of years ago is, the cookie's dying, that there's sort of another, that we got to sort of figure this out. And yeah, this idea of having this kind of free access and, rich third party data set to actually engage and understand your users is probably something that's going to be harder and harder to come by. I know I'm geeking out. We both work in the space, but can we just take look for the 1,000-foot view of this? Could you set the table a bit on, what do we mean by a cookie going away, and sort of what is the overarching impact that has on brands and advertising at large?
Sure. I was actually thinking about that in the shower this morning because getting ready to speak with you, I tend to a lot of times dive right into the technicals part and forget to kind of go through the bigger picture. But I guess where I take us back to is let's think about the world before digital, right? So if you think of like old school linear advertising, where you would have target audiences that you wanted to reach, and you would buy TV ads or radio ads or print, and you would kind of blast out those ads and hit everybody, and you're hoping that a portion of the people that you're targeting are within your segmented audience or your target audiences that you're trying to reach.
Yep.
There were two problems with that. Number one was measurement, right? Like it was all very old school measurement in terms of, I should say old school, but it was more of the control exposed groups, and that's how you were really gauging measurement back in those days, or looking at reach numbers or so on and so forth. But it was really hard in a linear advertising world to be able to track an impression or an exposure down to a conversion. And the second side was there's a lot of waste, right? So let's say you were buying a specific TV slot, let's say the 8 o'clock spot on Thursday nights on a certain show. Well, you're targeting that slot because you're hitting people who are in your target audience, but there's also a lot of people who aren't in your target audience. So it's waste, right? So you're
Mhm.
spending a lot of money to hit like a portion of your audience, but you're also hitting a lot of people who aren't in your audience. And then kind of tertiary on the third, I would say that you're also bugging a lot of people with ads that aren't relevant to them, right? And
Mhm.
so that's the old linear world. Well, as you go into digital, there was a lot of promises of digital, right? A lot of this is that you get more relevant ads exposed to you. Measurement should be better because we should be able to track better what ad impressions you've been exposed to or have likely been exposed to, and then be able to track that to an online conversion. And as the industry progresses into offline conversions too.
Yep.
And then also when you get into like programmatic ad buying and you really have more, you're limiting some of that wasted impressions because you're really only serving ads to the people who fall within your target audiences. And really, if you think about it that way, like how the world evolved, the cookie was one of the core components of that. And so, we focus a lot on cookies, but really what ad tech or what tech does in the digital world is try to leverage our first party data to inform better media buying across the stack, right, into the ad platforms.
Yep.
So and the cookies were really a foundational piece of that, right? So you have these anonymous cookies, a pixel, when you see an ad on a site, that pixel's firing off and creating a cookie in your browser. And then whenever you go and you complete a conversion action on a website, that floodlight is interacting with the cookie in your browser, and that's how you're tying the pieces together, right? That's from a
Yep.
measurement perspective. And then from a targeting perspective, inside of the exchanges between the SSP and the DSP, there's information being sent back from the publisher side about what demographics or what type of audience segments you fall into when that impression bid comes up. And then on the advertiser side, the demand side, you have advertisers who have already set up line items to go after certain target demographics or target audiences. And it lets you know whether or not you fall into that. And
And
so a lot of that is all the cookie. That's how that was all structured.
well, and Sean, I guess that's one, and I mean, just for my own clarification to make sure we're on the same page on this. When we're talking about cookies in the context of what you just said there, I think the key is as sort of digital evolved, right? And we were sort of in, you could argue if we're still in the heyday, but sort of the heyday of digital and programmatic ad buying. I think a lot of the power, right, in being able to make sure that the relevant ad and the absolute right target groups are being hit, sort of on ideally a sort of a person to person basis. Fundamentally, the way that worked, right, and this is, I think, and we can get into this, but the distinction between like a third party cookie and what we're talking about in terms of first party data and cookies. What a third party cookie allowed, a brand or an advertiser to do is see that user's journey, not only across like properties and sites and things they own, but also kind of what they were doing largely across the web, right? And so the idea, and am I right there? I wanted you to sort of expand upon sort of that difference.
So there's a lot of different varieties of third-party cookies out there. Some are just data collectors and are doing exactly what you're talking about.
Yep.
But really the third-party cookies, when we talk about what Chrome's announced and what's going to happen next year with Chrome is, I think the easiest way to explain it would be, let's look at retargeting, for example, right? So let's just take I recently bought a house. So I go
Yep.
to Home Depot a lot, to the website a lot. So I go to Home Depot, I start looking at drills. I don't purchase anything. At that moment, there's a cookie being stored in my browser. And it's typically going to be a third-party cookie that Home Depot has put on their site tags for, let's say, like a Criteo. Criteo is a great example because they're a huge retargeting
Yep.
platform. And that cookie has stored in my browser that I was looking at drills. Therefore, when I go out to other sites, and I think a lot of listeners will know this experience, right? It's a retargeting experience. You go to other sites or you go to Facebook, and then all of a sudden you're being hit with ads of all these 4 or 5 drills that you were looking at, trying to get you to come back in and buy them. And that's a classic example of a third-party cookie. And again, in this case, I'm just using Criteo as an example because they're one of the most prolific retargeting platforms out there. But
Yep.
that's how that all works, right? So that cookie is firing off or the tag is firing off when you're on the Home Depot site and you didn't check out. And then there's a cookie that has that information stored in your browser. And then when you go out into other publishers, let's say I go to ESPN, and I guess I see an ad for a bunch of drills to try to encourage me to come back and buy them. That's how the publisher side on ESPN, that's how they know. It's not really ESPN that knows that it's a bid slot. It's that Criteo knows that. They
Right.
know that I was looking at drills and how to serve me something, right? So the challenge is, and I think one core distinction that we should make is between first party and third party cookies. And first party cookies are cookies that have the host domain, right? So if I'm on homedepot.com, and I actually don't know if they use GA or Adobe Analytics, but analytics platforms, whatever analytics platform they're using, that cookie is being generated off of the homedepot.com URL. So that's
Right.
how that's a first party cookie, right? A third party cookie is going to have a URL that's different than what the domain you're on. So like a retargeting cookie, a Criteo, for example. And by the way, just full disclosure, I don't know if they even use Criteo. I'm just using these as pure.
Of course. Yeah.
Just
We're using, common tools and technologies for these examples.
Great. So that cookie or that tag that's firing that cookie would have it's not going to be a homedepot.com URL. It's going to be an advertising URL for the advertising platform.
Right.
And it's those third-party cookies that they're talking about. It's also worth noting we're already in this world. For anyone who's familiar with ITP 2.0 and what happened with
Right.
Safari, I think that was like 3 years ago. They started blocking third-party cookies a while ago.
Well, Sean, where I want to get, and I think this is, to me, this is like a pivotal. I'm thinking about the time span of the years and where we are now and where we were. The use case you just presented there is just so powerful because, in Criteo or any other kind of retargeting platform, what you could effectively do in partnering with someone like this is I may not have a direct relationship, right? Going back to your example of ESPN, and know anything about this user that's landing on my page. However, because, and I think this is where the cookie is so powerful, that cookie basically gives me a window into things that might be interesting outside of any content I serve a user that lands directly on my page, to ultimately be able to tie back or use some of my my display, right, to advertise to them effectively. And I think that only happens because there is fundamentally this technology that is a third-party cookie that's able to know, right, that I was on Home Depot looking at drills, which has nothing to necessarily do with what I'm going to ESPN for.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, being the geek that I am, and a huge comic book geek, I always think of cookies as spider tracers. There's something that keeps some of your behavior inside of your browser, and then whenever you go to publishers, like that information is accessible so that a relevant ad can be served to you based on your past viewing behavior that's been tracked.
Awesome. No, and thank you. And I know we're really taking baby steps here and looking at the 1,000-foot view, but I think that was such a core critical part of how a multi-billion-dollar industry basically, still does, but, really used to function, right? And to function effectively. And as you said, there were, lots of organizations and advertising technologies and things that sort of came up in this era that utilize this.
Well, I think it's also relevant. And so the other use case that's really important too, and we can't lose sight of, is the measurement side of it.
Right.
And the measurement's really important, right? And the way the measurement works is, and this is where you get into like post-click, post-view. But let's say I see an ad, I'm served an ad, I never click on it. The moment that that ad is served to me, that pixel tag inside that ad is putting information into my browser in the form of a cookie. And then let's say 2 weeks later, I go and purchase something from a website that ad had been shown to me before 2 weeks earlier. And then there's a floodlight in that checkout page. And when I go through that checkout confirmation, that floodlight is connecting with the information in my browser and that cookie and saying, okay, Sean was served an ad 2 weeks ago and saw that. And that's how they're connecting the dots from a post-view world where you're not actually interacting with ads, and we're trying to gauge exposures against conversions. And that's a really important piece of it too.
Sure.
And that's probably actually more, I mean, there are solutions, and there's a lot of solutions being pitched by a lot of different platforms out there, but the measurement is a really big, I should say, vulnerability when cookies completely go away.
Sure, sure. And obviously measurement's important because, if you're throwing millions and millions of dollars into growing your audience, re-engaging your existing audience. I mean, the first question with anything, right? When you're testing something out is like, is what I'm doing or what I'm spending money on actually effective? Like, what's my ROI for my investment? And you can't do that without measurement. Okay. So Sean, this is great. So we established how this technology dramatically changed and sort of built, a whole industry was sort of built around it. I guess, and I promise we're going to move off of third-party cookies in a bit. I want to get to first-party data, but you hit on this a little bit, but what's changed? And maybe I'll have you pontificate a little bit of why. Why is the cookie dying, I guess, is my question.
So a few years back, one of my good friends who did not go into advertising, he went into law. He's a lawyer. We were talking on the phone one day, and he starts telling me, and this is why I actually brought up Home Depot, because I always remember this conversation. And he's complaining to me that he had looked at drills at Home Depot, and then all of a sudden he's getting all these ads on his Facebook feed of drills that he should buy, and he was really creeped out by it. And I think that was ultimately what drove this, was that there was there's a bit of a misunderstanding from the consumer side about what is actually being collected, what's not. All they know is that they're seeing ads for something they were looking at a separate site on Facebook, and it's a little bit creepy. And I think that was kind of the impetus for it, and really drove us down this road of more consumer privacy and where is your data being shared, who's collecting your data, who's you leveraging your data. Because, and I get it. I mean, look, I'm a geek. I'm completely in the weeds of this, so I understand the technology in and out. But if I wasn't in this industry, and I'm just casually looking for drills one day on Home Depot, and then all of a sudden I see a bunch of ads on all these different websites that are targeting me with these drills that I was looking at, I can completely understand how that's creepy. I'm sure you could too. It makes it feel like all my browsing behavior is just out there for anyone to collect and see and do what they want with it. So I think that was really the impetus of it. And I think there's more consumer awareness of where their data is being shared and who's collecting their data and what is their data being used for. So I think that was the beginning of it. And then I think that we've seen this kind of repivot where, 10, 15 years ago, when we were still in ad networks and really before the really mainstream adoption of DSPs, SSPs, and exchanges, the world was pretty solid in digital. So, and what I mean by that is, if I bought, let's say I served you an ad from, across 3 different ad networks that I was buying inventory through, it would be hard for me to connect the dots between the 3 and say, okay, you saw these 3 different impressions and then you purchased. What would typically happen is each of the different ad networks would take credit for that conversion because they're siloed, right? That's what the term is, siloed. Over the years, we saw kind of a breakdown of those walls, and we started to see some more data merging between the different, as we got into programmatic, and we were able to track more of that consumer journey, so that instead of giving credit to each exposure, we were able to look at all the 3 exposures that happened at the same time or along the journey before you purchase, and then start to give credit. Okay, which exposure was it that really drove you to purchase, right? And this is all about measurement and driving. What we've seen, at least what I've seen, I shouldn't speak for everybody, what I've seen is more of a siloing again. I have a lot of theories on why. The classic examples that we run into almost every day are, let's take Facebook and Google. They're very solid ecosystems. So I'll give you an example. Let's say someone sees a YouTube video and they see a Facebook ad and then they purchase. Well, true, YouTube is going to take credit for that conversion, and Facebook's going to take credit for that conversion because they're not talking to one another from a data perspective, right? And so what ends up happening is I'm giving credit to 2 different ad exposures for one conversion, right? I don't have 2 conversions, I only have 1. Now, the vested interest, obviously, what is it on the ad side? You always, as an ad platform, you're always trying to take full credit as much as you can for the ads that you're serving, because as you just noted earlier, you want to drive ROI and show ROI and have people buy more advertising through your network. So it's almost like and again, this is all just my theories. I don't have anything to prove that it's not completely altruistic, but
right.
Interest into silo your data so that you take maximum credit for your impressions and people spend more money on your ad platforms.
Right. Right. Listen, maybe we do a part 2 of this episode where we talk about multi-touch and last click attribution, and that's a whole a whole separate window. But okay, this all makes sense, and I agree with you. I think honestly, like going back to your example, I think it's as simple as it's just consumer behavior and consumer awareness of what was going on. To your point, yeah, I think part of that was misunderstood. Like, look, before I got into this world of sort of MarTech and ad tech, I had no idea. Like, it was absolutely magic to me how, going back to the Home Depot, how I could go on ESPN and, I'm seeing something I clicked on.
Well, you call it magic, but what was your really gut feeling when you saw that? Like, did you feel creeped out when you saw those ads?
You know what it was? For me, it wasn't creepy just because I was like, okay, I see ads, right? And I imagine somebody gets to make money off of this if I click on it and do something. But in exchange, I could read about my favorite player and what have you. I wasn't creeped out, but I think it's in like, and again, I'm no expert, right? I'm just, these are just my personal thoughts, feelings on it, but I think it very like first it's awareness, right? Like it was awareness of this is like I'm being served these personalized ads. And then I think second, it's like it caught steam, right? More and more people became aware of it. I think, regulatory bodies became aware of it, right? This was largely probably with any new technology, right? Something that wasn't super regulated, when the technology was available or made available all those years ago. And I guess, I don't know, like, is there part of this too that, some of this was taken too far, right? Like, where there's just certain, overzealous, that competitive force, right? Of all these players trying to drive the maximum ROI and trying to drive the maximum exposure, was it sort of overexhausted, right? Did programmatic sort of stretch too far to the point where, maybe that changed consumer expectations?
It's a good question.
It's hard to say, right? I mean, I'm just,
it's hard
I'm
to
not,
gauge like
yeah,
what is too far, right? Like that's
right.
a subjective term. I will say I would always encourage and do think that it's good that consumers have more awareness of where their data is being tracked and what's happening with their data.
Right.
I do think that's very important. I think as outside of advertising, just the internet in general has evolved so much, and as more and more of our lives happen on the internet or just become the internet, basically, like you should know where your data is being tracked. And I think that's a very strong. It's good for consumers to have that awareness. I mean, because again, when I'm talking cookies, I'm talking. It's the other funny thing about cookies is it's really a desktop. It's a desktop browser thing.
Right.
It doesn't really
Right.
work on mobile apps. But if you think of how the internet has changed so much over the past 20 years, where we have these smartphones on our hip all the time,
Yep.
and that's another thing that's interesting about cookies is that, if you think of a desktop computer or a laptop, multiple people in a household might be using that laptop. And so that browse, it's not specific, it's not one-to-one because,
Right.
if multiple people are logging into that browser, well, the cookies are being stored in the browser. And so you have different behaviors all being lumped into one collection of cookies on a browser is being shared by multiple people. When
Yep.
you get to the mobile phones, that's much more one-to-one because typically speaking, there's not other people using your smart device, right? I'm assuming, I don't know, if you have an iPhone or you have a Droid, whichever one you have.
Right.
I'm assuming that it's not typical for you to let other people start browsing around on your phone, right? Everyone else. So it's much more one-to-one from a behavioral perspective. And I think that's where it's very important for consumers to be aware of what data is being collected.
Yeah. And I'd say like, I think that's a absolutely safe assumption. When you talk about the shared device on a desktop, I always think back to like my old, like high school computer lab or something, and it's like, what's the, what does that say about me as a user, but anyway, I mean, Sean, okay, thank you so much for staying on the topic of just cookies at large and third parties. I guess now I want to get into more of your world now and sort of, and let's talk about industry trends in this context. Okay, we've established what third-party cookies are, why they're, powerful, right? Like what purpose they served and why they're going away. And so I guess the natural next question I have for you is, how do brands continue to reach their target audience and make relevant connections, get their brand and image out to relevant users in a world where, you don't have, necessarily that access to third-party data as easily?
So there's a lot of different schools of thought here. Some of them are actually going old school, and some of them are going more kind of next stage or futuristic. You actually touched on one earlier, right? So contextual targeting is one of your safer ones, right? Like
Mm,
if I'm on ESPN, you want to serve ads that are around sports on ESPN, because the thought being that if I'm interested and that's the content I'm consuming, if the ad is relevant to the content I'm consuming, then I would be into the ad as well, right? And that's, I mean, contextual targeting has been around for a long time. I've used it a lot in the past, and that's an interesting perspective because it doesn't really require collection of data, because what you're
mm.
doing is the consumer is raising their hand by going to that site that's specific to some niche of content, and then you're serving ads, right? So
Yeah, and that's not so
um,
different than linear, right? Like, I mean, going back
now
to yeah, it's like pre-digital almost.
the difference is that with linear, there was no way to buy a single impression, right? So you could do contextual targeting on a single page or on a single site, where linear was a little bit wider. So I think there's more
Mm,
waste in there. But yeah, so that's one way around. There's been a lot of talk, and I hear a lot of people talking about that as well. The other way is leveraging first party data, and leveraging first party data, and this is where it gets really interesting. Ad tech, if we really think of what is ad tech, what is the point of ad tech? The point of ad tech is, how do we take our first party data and leverage it to inform our media buying and to reach the right audiences? Very high level description of that. But what
mm,
I mean by that is, so let's go back to the cookie conversation. So if we're using Adobe Analytics or Google Analytics, those are first party cookies that we're collecting the behavior when you're on our site. So that's all first party data that we're collecting on you. So
yep.
you come to Acme site, then we sell Acme widgets, and you're browsing around, and I'm collecting all that data on you as you interact with my product site.
Yep.
How do I then take that and be able to match that out into these third party other publishers or other areas that you're out on the internet, and be able to use my first party data to serve you relevant ads, to decide whether or not I want to serve you an ad, and if I do serve you an ad, what creative do I serve you? And that's really where ad tech comes in. And so what it's doing is a lot of, and I should say cookies are part of ad tech too, but I think where the industry's evolved is that with the coming demise of third-party cookies, like, how else can we match across different platforms?
Exactly. Yep.
So if you're user A on my site and you're user B in Facebook, how do I connect those dots so that I know if I know that user A in my system is user B in Facebook, now I can use my first party data to say, okay, this is what you did on my site. You might want to see an ad about X, and then be able to serve it to you on Facebook. And that's a lot of where the industry is now. And a lot of it is done today through identity mapping.
Right.
And there's a lot of different varieties of this. But the most basic one would be, and I'm sure anyone who's ever operated inside of advertising at Facebook, you can upload custom lists into Facebook. So you would take, people who sign up for an email newsletter on your website, you could take all those emails, load them into Facebook, and then Facebook will use that data to match against emails that they've collected on their side. When they make a connection, they're able to flag that person as in this custom audience, and then you can serve ads against that custom audience. And
Right.
that's not exclusive to Facebook. Google does it a lot. Most of the ad platforms, Snapchat does it, Twitter, they all do that now.
Right.
But that's kind of like your backbone. Where it gets more advanced is when you get outside of emails, we get into maids, when you get into, and which is also the iOS 14 thing that just happened, and
Mm,
all of that, which that's probably a topic for a whole other show. But and then we get into IDs and how do IDs work, and there's a lot. This is where a lot of the industry has been focusing on the past few years is how do I how can I stitch together this person across different publishers so that we can serve them ads, but also do it
right.
in a privacy safe way so that I don't, when I send that list to Facebook, they're not keeping that data. They're simply using that email to say, this is another common misconception too with people or consumers, I think, is
Uh-huh.
if you've signed up as 12345@gmail.com on my site, and then your account at Facebook is 12345@gmail.com. Well, when I send that custom list up to Facebook, they're going to scan it and they're going to see, okay, they've seen this email before, so they're going to flag it, right? But if they
Yep.
haven't seen that email, it's not like they're going to retain that email. They wipe that out and scrape it. So we're only using that point of PII simply to make that connection and say this is the same person across both platforms.
Wow, I didn't realize that. I thought that was sort of part of the value trade when you work with an ad network. It's like, hey, send us all the data you have on your users. Obviously we'll target and reach the ones that we match on, but we're sort of, we're sort of going to keep
No.
whatever
Well,
to feed sort of our identity. And I'm not like, so maybe there's technologies there, but at least largely, right, when we're talking about like the Facebooks of the world, it really is just to find a match, right? And it's that match on, in this example, it's an email.
now let me be clear. So
Okay.
Facebook says they don't keep that data. I
Oh,
can't.
sure.
I
Yeah,
can't
yeah.
verify
Okay.
that. And then number two is with the ad platforms like Google or Facebook. Correct. They're not keeping that data. But there are other onboarders and there are other identity providers that we do leverage, which that's a whole other kind of avenue that do keep that data, and they are building identity spines of their own as well.
But
So it does
that's
happen, but not typically like a Facebook, Google, like those type of ad platforms aren't keeping that data.
sure. Fair enough. And I guess, where I want to go with that is like that's a really interesting paradigm shift, right? Because now, you know, with browsers and device manufacturers, right, sort of making that third party tracking, either it's going to go away entirely, right, or we're going to see a far more limited use of third party tracking. It really is sort of now a matching game, right? It's like, hey, like what pieces of information about a user do you have, your user A, and is there a link between my user B? And if there is, then there's something we can do collaboratively, right? There is some way um, to sort of engage this user and serve them something relevant. And for brands, right, continue to get their message and their product and experience out to the most relevant people. When it sort of allows that the industry at large to sort of continue, right? But it's that shift between sort of one technology into more of, I think, what you just described, which is sort of more of an identity resolution um, use case under the hood.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, if we were to go back to measurement, I think that's probably one of the easiest ways to describe this is when you're on my website and you buy a product, you submit your email through the checkout process. So I know your email and I know that you bought a product. That's all my first party data. And then on Facebook, we served you 5 ads, but we don't know that because Facebook's not sharing that with us.
Right.
But on Facebook's side, they have an email tied to a profile, and they know their profile because that's their first party data. They know what ads that they've served to you because you're on their site. So how do you make that connection? Because what I want to know is which ads were you exposed to before you bought something off of my site so that I can attribute those exposures back to that conversion, and that informs my media buying going forward, and where should I allocate my media budgets to be most effective. And it's that handshake in the middle that a lot of a lot of the ad tech industry, that's what we're working on. Is that what is that handshake to be able to cross those two sets of first party data, again, in a privacy compliant way, so that we can really just attribute where we're spending media and is it working or is it not.
Right. Oh, that makes all the sense in the world. And I think that's key too. The point about privacy, I think, should be underlined here. I think the idea is, right, like as brands, right, that have and sort of are building more direct one-to-one relationships, want to actually get to know who their consumers are, sort of from the first interaction, which may be, an ad, a display ad that you get exposed, all the way through, the 15th purchase or the 200th video you view in a service. It's like, brands want to make sure they cater and really understand, right, like who their customer is, and be able to tailor and personalize experiences and ultimately do what sort of on a one-to-one basis that user sort of wants out of a particular experience. But we want to do that in a privacy compliant way. So things like, honoring a user request to say, hey, like I actually don't want my data that you're collecting to be used for marketing, and then being able to control that and having brands be able to sort of honor and the advertising industry, right, that handshake, if you will, is done with the assumption that, hey, there's this notion of consent here, right? Like we've understood our consumers and we're only doing this with our consumers, that ultimately said, yes, like I'm okay with this.
Well, I think it's one of the biggest I think another big challenge we have coming is the different legislations across the different states.
Sure.
CCPA was one of the first out of California. I dealt a lot with GDPR over in EU, but I think there's a lot of other states that are moving forward with other types of legislation that are a little bit different in terms of how they view privacy and what are the restrictions on privacy. So, years ago, I used to work with a alcohol distributor or alcohol store. And one of the problems with liquor is that each state has different laws. And so it becomes really, really hard when you're marketing, because you have to basically have campaigns at a state level, because each one has different restrictions and different kind of laws that you have to abide by. And as privacy becomes something that the state legislatures continue to pass new laws around, well, now it becomes more complex, because everything you're doing from really a privacy compliance standpoint has to be at the state level, and you're running national campaigns. So it becomes much more fragmented and a lot harder to manage.
Yeah. And like you said, that's exactly the data chaos that creates, and what challenges that present to a brand to be able to actually track and honor and properly execute that is, we'll save that for part two. But it's interesting, right? I mean, it is a shift in, I think both, like, all parties involved, right? The consumer, the brand, and then sort of the, advertising, MarTech, ad tech ecosystem at large are sort of, I mean, this is playing out as we speak, right? And I guess
you have the privacy piece and the other piece, and I'll go back to a point I made earlier too. It's a little bit, again, I want to be careful here, because this is one of my own theories, but think about that example I just gave you of like how we know that you purchased something on our site, and that's our first party data. Facebook knows that it serves 5 impressions to that profile, right? But now let's say Google served 5 impressions to that profile. And then we also serve 5 impressions across trade desks to that user. Yeah. Well, those 3 different ad platforms all want credit for that conversion. You're going to end up with 3 conversions being attributed when you only have 1 conversion actually happen. And that becomes very obfuscated. Measurement becomes very, very, very hard in this side of the world. And there's a lot of solutions. Google's come out with, because they're the ones kind of the impetus behind the Chrome, which the reason third-party cookies is such a big deal now, and why it was so big with Safari, was that Safari is just not the dominant browser on the laptop desktop world where cookies really work. Chrome is. And so when Chrome deprecates third-party cookies, that's a huge, I don't know the exact numbers. I was going to make it up, but I'm not going to make it up. But it's well over 50% of the marketplace is Chrome adoption. Sure. And so you're really knocking out third-party cookies.
This has been a masterclass so far. I've already learned so much, and I'm probably going to go back and listen to this a couple of times. But taking a few steps back, I guess.
Sure.
We talked a lot about this shift and sort of this idea that, hey, yeah, as a brand, like, I'm maybe so more interested, and I'm taking a more granular view at like who my users are and like what they're doing on my properties. And you've been around, the block a couple of times, been through your fair share of digital transformations at organizations.
Hey, I'm not that old. You just made me feel very old.
No, I mean, look, in tech years, right? I think you are, right? I think, a year in tech is probably 7 years of life experience, especially in ad tech. So, no offense on real biological age. This is strictly tech age I'm talking about. No, but seriously, Sean, I mean, in terms of like the evolution of like first party data, right? And brands sort of understanding their users better, any sort of advice that you have to, maybe someone in your shoes at another organization that traditionally did rely a lot or does continue to rely a lot on third party partners to ultimately reach their customers? Like, how can brands that are kind of reliant on more outsourced and third-party outreach to their customers build more of that first-party data strategy?
I mean, first-party data strategy to me is all about a relationship with the customer. You have to build a relationship with the customer, and we're seeing this, right? A lot of the CPG brands that historically had not collected a lot of this first-party data are building strategies to collect that first-party data. For me, being in the streaming world, and it's a subscription base, right? So you sign up, there's already a relationship there. But with a CPG brand or some of these other brands that don't have the subscription models, there isn't an inherent relationship built with that touch point, right? But they're starting to figure out ways to build those relationships. You'll see a lot of these publishers on that side, on the publisher side, who have multiple different websites, are building single sign-ons. So that you sign on with the email one site, you can use that email and the sign in across multiple different sites. Well, that's great, because when you're doing that, what you're doing is you're showing them, okay, you're the same person across these sites, so you can leverage that journey. And they know who you are across different publisher sites. On the brand side, it's about building reasons for them to engage with you, right? So some of this
Mm,
is, you'll see us more now. When you ever notice how when you go to do any type of online checkout now, there's always options to create an account to save us so you don't have to check out as a guest the next time. Those are
for
obviously
sure.
strategies trying to build that relationship with you so they can start to collect some of that information. And I wouldn't even say collect it because they're collecting it, but they're building a spine by which they can append that information so that they know that you're the same user coming across every single time. Um, it's strategies like that. And to be fair, I am definitely not the expert on building these relationships from a brand perspective to create first party data, because most of my life I've been working inside of these either subscription or they're just businesses that lend themselves to already having a relationship with the customer, and it's about
Yep.
leveraging that data. But I think
No.
in general, having that relationship is going to be key going forward. It's really important, and obviously in any type of relationship, you have to you kind of hit the nail on the head earlier in a slightly different way, but you have to show some type of value. Why would a consumer give you their data?
Right.
There has to be a
Right.
value exchange.
Yeah, yeah, and going back to and trust as well, right? And saying like, hey, if I'm going to give you my email or my address or tell you more about myself, like I sort of trust you to be a steward of that data and use that data in service of things I want, right? And in what I want to see out of out of this relationship. So that's a whole separate topic as well. It's sort of how do we start those flows? But that's a key point that a good point that you make too, Sean. It's like, it's so industry specific, right? And dependent. And you're right. Like in certain cases, like streaming, there isn't really a notion of being able to interact with you unless you identify yourself, right? Like I sort of have to have, or by and large, have to have sort of a subscription and preferences and all that stuff set in to even be able to interact with a streaming service. So good point. Different strategies for different organizations, but the fundamental crux of this is it's really being able to engage your direct consumers and giving them a meaningful reason to engage back, right? To share that information.
That's the key. Is meaningful. Because if you go back to my example, is that convenience of not having to, having going to an e-com site and give my information so I can just more simply check out next time. Is
Right.
that convenience enough for me to give away my information?
And maybe it's a loyalty program, right? Which is where, that whole category
correct.
Right. I realize we're at the top of the hour, but I had, the next two questions are relatively rapid fire and are going to take I'd say I'll take the under on 5 minutes. Any chance you can hang out for?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Awesome. Okay. So we're going to wrap with these, and these are fun, right? So my first question for you, and I ask every guest this, but as a consumer, what's your favorite brand or experience and why?
That is an interesting one. I used to love Red Bull when I was younger.
Okay.
I love the branding. I love the whole. I just love the whole kind of story that they told. I'm trying to think of a brand I really love now. That's a hard question because I don't necessarily have affinity to brands like that.
Or an experience, like is there something you do that you sort of enjoy? And listen, that could be digitally, that could be
All right, I'm going to geek out a little bit here. I absolutely love REI.
okay.
I'm a big outdoors person.
Okay.
And just the whole REI membership program and the way I think their customer service is just beyond anything I've ever seen. I'm obviously an REI member, and the ability to kind of return things if they're not working, or just I remember one time years ago I had bought a tent there, and I took it out to Yellowstone, and I'd broken one of the tent poles, and I went into an REI, and I was trying to see if I could just buy the replacement tent pole, and they literally said, you know what, just take a new tent, and they literally just gave me a new
Wow.
tent and replaced the whole thing. And I think that obviously drove me to buy a lot more things REI going forward because I had that experience, and I think it just says a lot about that experience and why I hold that brand in such high esteem in my head. And it at times might be a little more expensive, but I'll always buy from REI when I can because of that experience, because of other experience I've had with them. So I think just having that customer service and just that passion, every time I've ever gone to REI, they have passion for outdoors too. I think it's just a great experience all around.
Listen, food for thought in terms of, turning, customers into true ambassadors and champions. But, shout out to REI. That's awesome. All right. So the next 5 questions, Sean, they're all rapid fire, right? They're either, they're largely yeses and nos, or pick in between 2 options. So,
I feel like I'm on a game show.
This is the game show part of the podcast, and everyone's got to play. I can't let you go without playing. So, listen, you could take it wherever you want. You could expand on it if you want to, but I'm just going to power right through these. Pineapple on pizza, yes or no?
No.
Okay. All right. Fair enough.
I feel like it doesn't need an explanation. I'm just a no on that.
You and I are on the same page, but you'll see that in the description of every episode. Actually, I keep a tally of this, so you'd be surprised. There's some folks that are okay with this. Winter or summer sports?
Ooh, that's a hard one. I would say summer sports, just because I love the outdoors. I love camping so much. I do love to ski, but I don't think there's anything better than being in a tent out underneath the stars. So I would say summer.
2 for 2 in my book. Okay. All right. Just because, and I don't know. I mean, maybe this is more of a pop culture. I don't know how big of a basketball guy you are, but LeBron or MJ?
MJ.
Yeah. All right. Frozen yogurt or ice cream?
Ice cream.
Fair enough. And final question. Before I let you go, I'm a huge foodie. I'm hoping in a world where, the pandemic's kind of moving by, we could actually go and share a meal together. But, now that you're in St. Pete, I'll ask you this: favorite restaurant in St. Petersburg?
There is a restaurant in Gulfport, which is southeast St. Pete, called Pia's, and it's Italian food, and it is magnificent.
Pia's. Shout out to Pia's. All right, Sean. Well, listen, Yumi, Lee, and some of the mParticle crew, we're gonna come down, and Pia's is on my radar now. Awesome, man. Seriously, can't thank you enough for being a part of this.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to this conversation from Connected by mParticle. For more on this episode, you can check out the show notes and transcript on our blog. You can also subscribe to the podcast on any major podcast player. If building great customer experiences is important to you, sign up for our monthly newsletter, mPulse, which includes a very short list of the best blog articles, use cases, and industry reads from throughout the month. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.